Well, good morning, everybody. It's my privilege to come along and talk to you and tell you some stories about some of my adventures. But most importantly, I want to talk about how I go about achieving some of the things I've done, because I'm actually a fairly normal type of person. I do have a full-time job. I'm a Air New Zealand pilot. I'm very proud to fly for Air New Zealand, and I fly A320 aircraft up and down the country, around the Pacific Islands and across to Australia as well. I have a fantastic family. My wife is really awesome. I've got three really cool kids, and they're just normal kids. Some days they're cool, some days they're kids. But the thing that people don't actually know about me is I don't like heights. And my children think it's really funny because Dad climbed Mount Everest, but then Dad squealed on the roller coaster when we went to Disneyland a few years ago. But the big thing about me is I've been blessed with this ability to overcome some really big challenges to achieve some really cool things. And that's what I want to share with you today, is how I go about achieving some of the things I've done. And it comes down to three really core principles that I just repeat over and over again. And they're not very difficult, but they're things that I do over and over. This isn't a talk about how to climb Mount Everest. It's a talk about how to go about achieving things you think are impossible. So we'll get stuck into it. First thing I do with anything is I allow myself to dream. Now, the more I dream, the more refined my ideas become, and then I find what I'm passionate about. And that's so important, is finding what you're passionate about. Once I know what I want to do, I build myself a really strong plan, and I break it down into small parts. So it's a bit like a mind map, and I do it on an iPad these days, but I used to do it on paper or on a whiteboard, and I put my goal in the middle or my dream in the middle, and I break it down into parts, and those parts into smaller and smaller parts, so that when I get overwhelmed, and every single person in the entire world gets overwhelmed, I actually have a plan for being overwhelmed, and I can take one tiny step, and then another step, and then I find this thing called momentum. And momentum is so important, and you'll hear me talk about that a little bit. And the last thing, and without a doubt, the most important thing, is I just never give up. I honestly believe that if I don't give up, I can't fail, because I'm always moving towards my goals, even if it's just small movements towards them, but I'm always going forward. So how did it all begin? So I was aged 14, maybe 13 or 14, and I wanted to become a pilot. Really badly. This was my passion, my dream. I would go to bed thinking about it, and I'd wake up thinking about it. I was so passionate about it. The only problem was I was very average at school. I'd be lucky if I just passed my exams, and if that. And to be a pilot, you have to have really good grades. So I went and found the smartest kid in the whole school. His name was Chris, in my year. And I said to Chris, "How long are you going to study for on Friday?" And Chris said, 20 minutes. I thought, great. So we had a maths exam, so I went home and I studied for 20 minutes. Sat the exam and I was really confident. Got my mark and I got 46% and I failed. Chris got 93. That made me really mad. So I went home and we had another maths exam coming up in about 2 weeks, and I studied for 4 hours for that exam, and I sat it and I was a bit nervous. And then when we got our marks, I got 96% and I topped the class. I beat Chris. And from that day on, I worked out it wasn't how brainy I was. Brains had nothing to do with it. It was about how hard I was prepared to try. And I just started trying harder than the next guy. And then I got really good grades and managed to get into Air New Zealand. Now, I grew up in a place called Titirangi in West Auckland. And my mum was a solo mum. My dad left when I was about 11 years of age. I've never seen him again since. And it was a bit sad. But I really wanted to be a pilot. And I went up to the local, and you have to pay for your flight training. It's quite expensive. So I went up to the local supermarket and I put a tie and a shirt on and I asked for a job, and the guy looked at me and said, "Oh, there's no jobs, go away." And then 2 weeks later I went up again, same shirt, same tie, so he'd remember me, and I said, "Sir, I'm still really keen, I'm a hard worker, would there be any jobs please?" And he said, "No, but I remember you from 2 weeks ago. You come back in another week and there might be a job." So I went back another week after that and I managed to get a job. Cut a long story short, I started working after school while I was studying, because studying was so important, and I started learning to fly while I was still at school. I went to university, managed to get myself a degree in electrical engineering, and then I managed to get into Air New Zealand as a second officer, as a pilot. And I was flying all over the world, having a great time. And after a couple of years, I got a little bit lost. I couldn't put my finger on it. I loved my job, but I didn't have this passion inside me. So I started going out and thinking, I know how to achieve things. I'm going to go and run a marathon. And I just grabbed this goal out of thin air. I failed. Then I thought, right, I'm going to go and I'm going to do the coast to coast. Fantastic goals. I failed at that as well. And it wasn't until I took a huge step back and looked, I wasn't passionate about those things. I didn't have that driving passion. So I stopped setting goals and I just opened my mind and I let myself dream. And the way I did it is I read lots and lots of books. The more books I read, the more ideas I had. I read all of Ernest Hemingway's books, and some of those are really good. And then I fell in love with adventure and then eventually mountaineering. Now, I wanted to climb Mount Everest and I set that goal pretty early, but I kept it to myself because I was a bit embarrassed about telling anybody such a big goal. And I'd never climbed a mountain in my life when I decided to climb Everest. I've got a little film to show you. So this is what Everest looks like, and it took me 8 years of getting my experience and learning to climb and climbing all over the world. And what I wanted to do was to climb Mount Everest unguided, so without a guide, but I'll be managed at base camp by a professional team, a manager there, and they would look after me on a radio and they would provide me with camps up and down the mountain. But I essentially had to climb the mountain on my own. I had to carry all my own food and all my own gear as well. So you can see the camps going up 1 through to 4. You can't go straight to the summit. You have to go through the ice fall first up to camp 1, and then you come down and you rest. And then you repeat the cycle all the way to camp 2 and down again, and you do a third cycle all the way through the camps to camp 3, and then you rest. This is how you acclimatise, and this is why it takes so long to actually climb Mount Everest. The most dangerous part of Mount Everest is the ice fall that you can see around Camp 1, and it's a frozen glacier that's moving, and it's like a frozen waterfall basically, and it creaks and it groans. But also on the left-hand side on those photographs, there's a very large triangular shoulder. That's the western shoulder of Everest, and that avalanches pretty much every day across the ice fall, and that's what hurt the Sherpas back in 2014. So before you go into the mountains, you have to go and get a blessing. You get 2 blessings, and it's just part of the local tradition. And the first blessing is by this chap. His name's Lama Gershi, and he's the head Lama for the area, and it's down the valley a little bit. And I went to see him. He's a very, very nice man, and he said to me something that I will always remember. He said, "Mike, if everyone in this world just gave a little bit more than they take, the world would be a much better place." And I like doing that, so I like going around talking to schools and sharing my story with schools, and other interesting charitable and giving back sort of activities. Now this is a replica Yeti skull and a Yeti hand. Now the Yeti is an abominable snowman that is supposed to live in the Himalayas. I don't know whether I believe in the abominable snowman, but there's something in the Himalayas that scares the Sherpas, definitely, whether it's a bear or a snowman. But in the 1990s, this monastery had these artifacts, and they were real. And in the late 90s, they got stolen. And when they got stolen, they took away the little income as well. So this monk, I managed to get some replica artifacts made by Weta Workshops from Wellington that made Lord of the Rings, and I took them back up to this guy. Part of the problem I had was that with the language, as I was trying to convince him that they were replicas, not the real artifacts. But he was quite a funny man as well. He wrote to me. He walked for 3 days to find an email, and he wrote to me about a couple of months later, and he said, "Mike, you're very kind to this community. Thank you very much. Tourists are now coming up to see these replicas, and we're generating a little bit of an income. But we need your help again, please. We have some wild Tibetans that have come across the Himalayas, and they've destroyed one of our stupas, which is a big statue, and we need 600 kilos of cement to fix it. Well, the nearest road is 350 miles away, and he wanted 650 kilos of cement. But on the bottom of his email, he did the best sales line anyone's ever done. He wrote, "If you help us, you will have a good next life." I don't know whether I believe in the next life like he does, but I wrote to all my friends and I said, "I'm selling bags of cement for $50 a bag, and if you buy one, you're guaranteed to get a good next life," according to this guy. And I sold out within a couple of days. And he got a statue. So up to base camp, and then you get the second blessing at base camp. And the second blessing is what you see on TV, where we throw barley flour at each other. But that Lama was busy. So we decided we'd change the rules just a little bit, and we would go into the mountains. And I got to this place, and you can see some little black dots in the middle. Those are people. And this is crazy climbing. We're not going fast to Camp 1. We're just sort of milling around. And it's creaking and it's groaning and bits are falling off. So I decided that I would turn around, and I came back. And I walked across a very flat area called the football field, and it's probably it's about the size of a regular rugby field. And I got halfway across, and I heard a huge whoomph, and I knew exactly what it was. There was a massive avalanche had peeled off the western shoulder of Everest and was coming straight for us. So I had 2 choices. I could either unhook from the safety lines and run, and take my chances and try and jump across some of these crevasses, or I could stand and take my fate. So I chose to run. I unclipped, and I got across all of the crevasses, and I turned around, and I could see this avalanche coming straight for us, and it was flowing over the icefall like a freight train. And right at the last moment, I actually froze. And I didn't know what to do. And right at that particular moment, the avalanche hit a ridge, and all the energy dissipated upwards, and then it came down and just gave us a light dusting. And for some strange reason, I managed to take a photograph. You can't quite see it, but on the right-hand side, there's 2 tiny little dots, and those are a couple of friends of mine. So I went back down to base camp, and I said, "I'm not going anywhere until I get a blessing." We waited for 3 days, and then back through the icefall up to Camp 1. And then we were too scared to come down again and do another cycle because the icefall was so active. So we decided we'd go to Camp 2. Now, this part of the world, this is the Western Coombe, and I felt incredibly privileged and humbled to be walking there in the footsteps of legends like Sir Edmund Hillary and a lot of other people as well. And it's very, very humbling to be walking there, especially as a Kiwi. It's also very, very inhospitable. You walk along and it's minus 20 outside, and a friend of mine was walking with his mouth open, and because it's very hard, it's 20,000 feet, and the reflective heat off the snow actually burnt his tongue and his roof of his mouth, and they actually swelled up and blistered in the nighttime. So it's a very, very harsh environment. So up to Camp 2, and then we come down, we do another couple of cycles, and then finally you go and you rest for about up to 2 weeks, and you just wait for the weather. There's only about 10 days a year that you can climb Mount Everest, and that's when the jet stream winds move north, and you punch up and touch the summit, and then you come down. So we got the go. Back through the camps again, up to Camp 3 and carrying on, and you can see this yellow band there, this yellow rock. And this is great science because 400 million years ago, India was floating very, very slowly towards, as an island, very slowly towards Asia. When it hit Asia, it's pushed the Himalayas up, and people have actually found little fossils in that, inside the yellow band there. So Camp 4 is at 26,000 feet. It's about the altitude that I fly every day in, and you're on oxygen 100% of the time. Now, everything is very, very, very difficult. It takes you half an hour to get one boot on, and you get that boot on, and you're very proud of it, and you look down, and it's on the wrong foot. So it's really, really taking its toll on you. I remember that in that photograph being really scared as well. And some of the best lessons in my life have been from my mistakes or my failures. But they don't have to be your mistakes. They can be someone else's mistakes. So what I did is I got every single book there was on Mount Everest, and I read it cover to cover, and in the back I made little notes of why people failed. And the number one reason that I found that people failed climbing Mount Everest was actually punctuality. It's so hard to get ready that then if you're supposed to go climbing at 11 o'clock at night and you don't turn up to 12 or 1 o'clock, your chances of meeting the summit are completely gone, really. So now, like I said, I was climbing on my own, but on summit day, I'd have a Sherpa, and he would follow me and carry 2 bottles of spare oxygen. And 9 o'clock came, and we were leaving at 9, and we were going to be climbing all night. And there's this little voice says, "Mikey, let's go." And I came out, and I'm about 6'1", and I stood up, and my Sherpa was there. His name was Lakpa, and he was about 5'1". He was a foot shorter than me. And he was 10 times stronger than I was. And at that stage, it's all mental. It's all in your head. He looked at me and said, "Mikey, let's go. Tonight we're going to climb Everest." And we started walking along across a very, very flat part called the South Col. And then it gets really steep really quickly. And you hit your axe and you take one step and you step up. And then that's it. You're completely exhausted. And then you recover and you take one more step. And then this goes on all night. And I got myself into quite a good rhythm. And then out of nowhere came this huge wind. It almost knocked me off my feet. And I know what wind is like in Wellington. It's 60 knots. This would have been at least 70, 80 knots. And I held onto that rope, and then the wind went away. And then people started turning around real quick and going. And I remember being completely overwhelmed. And I didn't know what to do. But then I went right back to the basics. I kept saying to myself, am I safe? Can I feel my fingers? Can I feel my toes? And I had a plan for being overwhelmed. Sure enough, more wind came in, more people turned around, and I just stayed, going back over my plan, making sure I was safe. And then eventually the dawn came up, and a lot of other people had turned around, but I'd kept going. I'm right in the middle there, and on your left-hand side, it's about a 6,000 foot drop, and on the right-hand side, it's about an 8,000 foot drop. So it's really important, if you're going to fall off, you go to the left. Now, you can see me in the red suit. Right behind me is my Sherpa in the yellow suit. And I've got some footage of the rocks right in the middle, and that's the Hillary Step. And there's a friend of mine's filming just from the top.
This is Ward on the Hillary Step. Give you an idea of the exposure. So Tibet, Nepal, well done mate, keep coming. Lots of old ropes from previous expeditions. You hope you got the right one. Grab onto the whole bundle. Well done Ward. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to have to say goodbye now, but congrats. Thank you.
So I flew along the ridge, and this is the hardest part of the climb, up the Hillary Step, and then it gets quite steep. And I got past that steep part, and my Sherpa was a little way away, and then it flattens out. And it's probably about, I knew I was about 15, 20 minutes from the summit at that stage. And then I started to get really, really dizzy. and really disorientated. I started to stagger, and then I actually fell over. I was still clipped into the safety lines, but I fell over and I collapsed into the snow. And I turned around and I was looking out just from below the summit of Everest, drifting in and out of consciousness. And I remember thinking, I'm going to vanish. And I knew 40 people had vanished on that ridge, and I was about to vanish as well. And my Sherpa turned up, and he knew exactly what had happened. I'd run out of oxygen, and Lakpa saved my life. If it wasn't for Lakpa, I'd still be sitting there today. But as soon as that oxygen hit you, I stood up, I came around the corner, and I could see that summit of Everest. And I remember tears welling up in my eyes, and I remember thinking, you have worked so hard for this, Mike. There's no amount of money can buy that summit. You have worked so hard. And then I felt a tear sort of trickle down underneath my goggle, and then something clicked. There was no space for emotion. It was way too dangerous for a start. And secondly, your eyeballs are going to freeze if you cry on Mount Everest. And I turned to Lakpa and I said, we're going to take 3 photographs and 1 phone call and we're gone. And I took the last couple of steps and I managed to stand on the summit. I really, really like this photograph because I'm not standing there triumphant. Behind the goggles, I'm extremely scared for a start, but I'm very humbled to be standing there as well. And people say to me, Mike, you conquered Everest. And I find it really funny because I didn't conquer Everest. Everest allowed me to stand there for a couple of minutes, and I actually escaped with my fingers, my toes, and actually my life. And Sir Edmund Hillary, he sums it up beautifully. He says the only thing we conquered was ourselves, and I really like that. So I came back down. It's a whole other story coming down, but I got back to my tent, and my tent mate, he was a little bit slower than me. And also, he didn't really have the discipline to do the basics. Sometimes when you're overwhelmed and you don't know what to do, just do the basics, and then you will find momentum. But he didn't do the basics, and the basics were drinking water. So he managed to freeze his toes really well. And you can see the line where he's frozen his toes. And this is great science. You need to ask your science teachers in your next class, because we're made up of about 60 to 70% water, and in our cells and our muscles. And when water freezes, it expands and it actually kills the tissue. So it's killed his toe pretty good. And it got a little worse. And then finally he got chopped off completely. And that's quite a bad injury, because your foot's like a tripod. You have a big toe and a little toe and a heel, and if you damage one part of it, then it's going to take you a while. So I came back to Kathmandu, and my wife came up to see me, and she's my rock. She was bringing me home, and she said to me, and I was excited because I had a job offer on Everest again the next year, actually being paid to climb. And I told her, and she said something really smart. She goes, Mike, if you need to climb Everest, don't worry, we will find a way. She didn't mean it, but what she was doing was giving me space to work out that my children need a dad more than I need to go and climb Everest. And when I took a big step back of Everest, it actually wasn't the mountain, it was the relationships with people, the relationships with my Sherpas and my other climbers as well. So with her blessing, every time one of my children, I've got 3 kids, every time they turned 7, I took them to see Mount Everest. And you can't drag a child that far. It's 150 kilometres. They have to walk village by village. We just take it one step at a time. And we stay with the local Sherpa people, and it's absolutely magic. And seeing their interactions with the Sherpas is absolutely priceless. And we've gone back as a family as well a couple of years ago. So this brings me to my second point. So the first one was actually letting yourself dream. The second one was getting a strong plan. So I came back from Everest. I didn't set any goals. What I did is I just allowed myself to dream, and I started reading books. It's such a great source of knowledge, and I read heaps of books that I wanted to read. And it was about 2 years. It took me 2 years to find what I wanted to do next. And I read a book by Sir Ranulph Fiennes, and he was the first man ever to run 7 marathons in 7 days on 7 continents of the earth. No one had ever done it in New Zealand, and only 2 other people had ever done it in the world, and I decided, that's it, I'm going to do it. So this brings me to my second point. I got myself a strong plan. I broke it down into parts, got myself a logo, got myself a website. My hero when I was growing up was a guy called Rod Dixon. He won the 1983 New York Marathon. And then I went for a run, and everything fell apart. My knees hurt, my feet hurt, my back hurt. I only ran 5 kilometres, and I couldn't run. Running had gone from Rod Dixon in my head to the guy on the ground lying down. That's what it felt like to me. But I wasn't worried because I had this plan. I went back and I went to the tiniest little part, and I had actually broken the goal down into these parts, and one of them was inspiration. And I went on YouTube and I got some inspiration off YouTube, and then I actually learnt to run. I typed in how to run and I learnt to run off YouTube. And pretty quickly I turned into a really good runner. Wasn't super fast, but I could run really good distances and without injuring myself. So the idea was to go to Antarctica, start my stopwatch and run one marathon on every single continent of the earth within 7 days to be back in New Zealand.
You got it.
Finished. Mate, 4 down, 3 to go. You're over the hump.
Well over halfway, right?
Superstar.
About 14 kilometres into 6 marathon in 6 days and 6 continents. It's tough. It's really tough.
So I went to the Falkland Islands, it sits on the continental shelf of Antarctica, over to Chile, then up to Los Angeles in America, London, Africa. I went to Morocco and Casablanca, Hong Kong was Asia, and then back to New Zealand for Australasia. Now you can imagine how many times I got overwhelmed. Running one marathon, the thought of running another one, let alone getting on an aircraft for 10 to 12 hours is just overwhelming. So I wouldn't think about it. I'd think about that next moment I was in, whether it was my nutrition or putting on my skins or doing something. And then I'd find this momentum and I'll be off. I ran the last 4 kilometres with about 200 friends and supporters, and the last 1 kilometre was just with my family, and we crossed the finish line together. We raised over $75,000 for Kids Can. Now, I made the classic Kiwi mistake, and I want to share this with you. It was a really big stuff up. I was afraid to fail. So I overtrained, and I climbed up a mountain next to Everest when I was taking people, guiding them to base camp, and I was scared I wasn't going to be tough enough. So I wanted to find a place to see how strong I was, because on Everest, the only option is being strong. If you're not strong, then there's no other option. So I wanted to find that place, but in a controlled way. So I climbed up this mountain, and I started a marathon from 18,500 feet, and I ran this marathon just with my Sherpa friends. Cut a long story short, I got back to New Zealand and I managed to put a stress fracture in my lower spine because I had been overtraining and I didn't really know what I was doing. And it was a huge mistake. I was pretty devastated. So I went and spoke to lots of my friends and really sort of talked to a lot of people about it. I lost $16,000 worth of airfares because I was about to go on my first attempt at the 777. And this brings me to my third point about never, ever giving up. I kept saying to myself over and over again, I don't have to do this now. I can do it in 5 years or 10 years. As long as I don't give up, I'm not going to fail. And sure enough, my back healed. I found my passion again. I started running and I ran the 777. But I had some unfinished business. I wanted to go up there and to run this marathon properly. And I wanted to make a film for young people, exactly your age, about overcoming this fear of failure. The fear of failure has killed more dreams than failure ever has. And not trying, that is failure in my book. So I went back, and the first year, this is what it looked like. This is just before I broke my back, so I'm running as fast as I can because it's at 17,500 feet and the camera's on me. Then the next year, when we went back with the film crew, it looked like this, with the largest dump of snow and living memory in the Himalayas a week before we got there. So we had a few challenges to overcome, but we managed to do it. So that's available free of charge. It's on YouTube or on Vimeo. There's a really good copy on Vimeo for everyone to watch. It's only about 45-minute film. Now, I'm going to finish off with a very quick story about out of my book, at the start of my book, before I summarise and have my conclusions. So I've managed to write a book. I think there's one copy in the school library here, and it starts off with a very serious plane crash. And this is a great adventure for young men. I was flying an aircraft from America back to New Zealand, and we were what's called ferrying the aeroplane. The aeroplane was designed to fly 300 miles, and we had to fly it 2,100 miles to Honolulu and then back down to New Zealand. It was a Twin Otter, which is about the size of a Beech 1900 that used to fly around here. And we took it to San Francisco, and the engineers pulled all the seats out of the aircraft and they put 5 big fuel tanks in it. We got all the appropriate checks done. Everything was done by FAA, all signed out legally. We got airborne, we started flying to Hawaii, and we got about halfway, and everything seemed to be going fine. But once we passed halfway, the fuel started running really, really slowly from the ferry system, from the fuel tanks inside the aircraft, to the point where we were not going to make Honolulu. So we knew that we were going to have to ditch into the sea. So we put out a mayday call really early, and I climbed out of the co-pilot. I was the first officer, the co-pilot. Climbed out of the co-pilot seat, and I crawled across the top of these tanks because there's nowhere else to go. It's about an 18-inch gap. Got down to the back, and I cut the fuel lines. And I transferred this fuel into 1-gallon bottles, and then crawled up the front and poured it into the front tanks because they seemed to be flowing. Now, we couldn't keep up with the demand of the engines. It was no good. The Coast Guard, the American Coast Guard, they sent out 2 F-15 fighters to come and find us, and a Hercules and a few other military vessels were relaying comms or communications for us, but it was no good. We were going to end up in the sea. It's now pitch black at night, and we knew that over 1,000 people had died just off the coast of Honolulu in history. About 300 aircraft had crashed off that coast, and not one person has survived. So I crawled into the front, and I got into the front, and the captain looked at me, and he said to me, "Mike, we've already spoken about this. You go down the back. There's no place for you here. Your emergency position is down the back." But he was my mate. He was my friend. And I couldn't live with myself if I sat down the back and watched him do it. So I said to him, "I'm going to stay here, but I've got one thing to do." And I got this pen, and I wrote this note to my girlfriend at the time, and I put it down my underpants. And he looked at me, and he goes, "Why did you do that?" And I said, if they find my body, they're going to find my last words. And he looked at me and he goes, "That's a great idea. It's getting this serious." And he said, "You fly." We didn't have any autopilots. So I'm flying on this side, and he gets his pen and he starts writing. And he looks up and he looks over at me and he goes, "What did you write in your note?" And we sort of laughed, but it got really serious really quickly. And then I remember being really scared and really overwhelmed. But what I did is I came back to the basics. I came back to telling myself over and over again, I'm going to be a professional pilot right to the very end. Both engines flamed out. We started to glide. We had 3 hours of fuel inside the aeroplane, but we couldn't access it to the right tank, and we were 1 hour offshore. So it was a real tragedy. We came down, I pulled my window down, and I stuck my head just out the window into the slipstream, and I remember I could see the water, and I'm waving the captain down, and he's just checking forward, and the Coast Guard had dropped some flares on the water for us, so we had about 6 flares that we could see. And I got to the end, and remember, it's pitch black, it's night time now, there's no moon, and I got to the end of the flare path, and I pulled my head in, and we were so close to the water, and I looked up, and there was one flare, pitch black sky, or pitch black sea, one flare, and then pitch black sky. And you actually need 2 flares to get depth perception to be able to land the aircraft. And so I looked over the captain, and he's just checking forward on his instruments, looking at my hand. And I shouted, "Only one flare, go around." And he knew exactly what has happened. And I pushed the thrust levers up, and we started to turn. And as we turned, everything's breaking loose. It's all getting a bit overwhelming. His door flew open, and his boot fell out. And what had happened is we had these doors on the front of the aeroplane, and we knew that we were going to get knocked out on the impact. So we hoped if we jacked the doors open just a little bit, they'd snap off and we could bring some water into the cockpit. And so his door slammed shut, so he said, "Quick, you fly." So I'm trying to fly, but on my side there was no instrument. So I had to look over his side and fly between the 0 and the 1, just skimming across the tops of the waves. We lined it back up. Swap control again, I waved him down. This time I could smell the water. There's 4 or 5 flares, and he closed the thrust levers, and after a few choice words and shouting at each other, he closed the thrust levers, and we hit the water, And as we hit the water, the aircraft got driven into the water, and the cockpit got driven about 20 feet below the surface, and it stayed there. Everything went in slow motion. All of my clothes got blown off in the impact. I got crushed into the control column. My jaw got locked open, and I remember swallowing water to the point where I couldn't swallow any more water. And then a very calm thought came across my mind, and it was that if I took a big, deep breath of water into my lungs, I'd be at peace. And I wasn't scared. And what it is, and if anybody surfers know what this is. This is an involuntary breath. And most surfers put their hands over their mouths to stop it. I didn't know that. And so I relaxed. I couldn't hold my breath any longer, and I took this huge breath, expecting it to be water. And right at that particular moment, the aircraft bobbed out of the water, and there was about 2 inches left in the cockpit for me to breathe. And we took a big breath. Very dramatic rescue. Cut a long story short, they vectored a ship to us, and they sent out a little tender, and this tender came out to pick us up, and we hopped into our life rafts. And then the tender came out, which is like a little tugboat, and it took us back to this huge container ship. And a container ship is about 100 feet high. It's really high. And they threw a rope ladder over the side, and they said, whatever you do, climb the rope ladder real quick, otherwise the tender is going to go away and come back and slam into the side of the boat and kill you. I thought, great, I've made it this far, and now I'm going to get killed. Still my underpants on, which is really good, and I grabbed hold of that rope ladder, and I climbed up the rope ladder, and then I collapsed onto the deck of this ship. And a very shiny pair of shoes sort of appeared in front of my eyes, and this guy picks me up. And as he picks me up, he's German, and he says, "Welcome to the Columbus, Canada. Where are you from?" And I'm shaking, I'm in shock. And I said, "I'm from New Zealand. Thank you so much for rescuing us." And he goes, "You're a Kiwi. We've rescued heaps of you Kiwis." And they had. There's so many yachtsmen that have got lost, and this ship had rescued so many, and we were just another Kiwi. So this brings me to my conclusions. So I got home after that trip. Bear with me, a couple more minutes. I got home after that trip, and I went round to my mum's house. My mum said to me, she goes, I know you're going to fly again, Mike. If you think you're too cool because you've crashed an aeroplane, if you have something else go wrong, you've got post-traumatic stress. You need to come and see me, and I'll get you some help. Very, very wise words. But then she said, go and have a bath. You're a mess. So I sat in her bath, and it's the first time as an adult that I let myself dream. And I dreamt about a life of adventure and wanting to do a whole lot of stuff. I never dreamt like that before. And sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for, because a couple of months later I was flying in Fiji, and I had a few really choice moments up there. So that brings me to my first point. And there's 3. The first one is dreaming. Why dreaming is so important. The more you dream, the more refined your ideas become. And the more refined your ideas become, then you find what you're passionate about. Once I worked out I didn't like running, I hated running, I was passionate about the adventure, everything fell into place. The second point is about getting a strong plan. Build a plan that's so strong that you can break it down into little parts, so that when you get overwhelmed, you can simply take one step at a time, and then you'll find momentum. The most important one is never, ever give up. If you don't give up, you can't fail, because you are always moving towards your goals. I'd like to leave you with one last thought, and it's this, and I'm the perfect example of this, that we are limited only by the limitations that we set upon ourselves. I had never ever climbed a mountain before I set my limit of climbing Everest. If I'd set my limit at 1 marathon, I would have achieved it, but I didn't. I had that courage. And this is a big thing, finding that courage to set your limits high. And if you set your limits high, you'll be amazed at what you can achieve. And once you've achieved something you thought was impossible, you actually develop a whole new set of beliefs, and those beliefs allow you to go on to achieve greater and greater things. And at the end of the day, it comes down to a few little words, about 5 of them, that if you believe you can, then you will. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.